Muy buenos días. Les damos la bienvenida.
Good morning. We'd like to invite everyone that is here accompanying us today in this online seminar called Gender Dialogues in Education. This activity is framed within the second cycle of webinars that we have called Educational Challenges in Times of Post-Pandemic, which have been organized by Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile and the Chilean Agency for International Cooperation for Development, ACSI. These seminars, the purpose is to gather the
Latina, Centroamérica y el Caribe y otros países a reflexionar sobre los desafíos educativos para la formación en tiempos de pospandemia en materias de educación.
post-pandemic in terms of education and gender. Sorry, they had muted me. And digital education. Our activity is being broadcasted through streaming through the official YouTube channel of Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile, and it's with simultaneous interpretation from Spanish into English and from Spanish into Portuguese, thanks to the collaboration of our interpreters Sangre Hageman and Maria Pasconta. We'd also like to greet our Chilean sign language interpreter, Francisca Orellana, who will accompany us during this day. I'd like to especially greet the authorities that are accompanying us today, the Dean of the Faculty of the School of Education of Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile, Mr. Alejandro Carrasco, the coordinator of Sur scholarships of the Unit for Training of Human Capital ACSID, Mrs. Maria Paz Troncoso, the Vice Dean of the School of Education of Universidad Católica, Mrs. Pilar Cox. We'd also like to greet other authorities from the educational system, different scholars, academics, students, and especially our guests, panel guests, Rosario Olivares Saavedra, academic from Universidad Alberto Hurtado, Gabriela Barquinton from Universidad de Córdoba in Argentina, and Nancy Esco from the University of Columbia from the US. And of course, Ana Luisa Muñoz, academic of the School of Education of Universidad Católica, who will be responsible for moderating the Q&A panel at the end of our activity. We would also like to congratulate her for her award as a distinguished alumni of the University of Buffalo in New York. We'd also like to greet everyone that is connected through streaming through the official YouTube channel of Universidad Católica. To begin with this seminar, I'd like to leave you with the Dean of the School of Education of Universidad Católica, Mr. Alejandro Carrasco. Welcome, Dean. Thank you, Erica. Good morning to everyone. We are quite pleased to initiate a second seminar in this partnership that we have with ACSID. I'd like to greet Maria Paz Troncoso, who is accompanying us today on behalf of ACSID, and Vice Dean Pilar Cox, who has been working hard in organizing this seminar. We in this partnership wanted to converse, to talk, discuss about important topics that from the School of Education of our university, we believed are important to contribute to public dialogue. We had the first seminar on digital education, and the second seminar and last seminar, we thought talking about gender in education was critical, of utmost importance. It is because Chilean society and the world in general, but specifically the Chilean society after the feminist movement a couple of years ago, it continued through a path at a higher pace for reflection and transformation in the road of eliminating gender inequalities that exist in our society, and that summoned everyone from our spaces. The university plays a critical role in this, and particularly the School of Education in generating research, public dialogue, and in training. We train trainers, teachers, professors, and this is a critical space. Generally, inequality and gender stereotypes, they are produced at an early stage, or they are culturally made up, composed at an early stage. So it's a training of professors in a privileged space to discuss, deconstruct, and all these inequalities. Non-sexist education is a very important agenda in our country, and from this space, from the School of Education, we've wanted to reflect on this. And each organization, we've been working on that. We assembled a commission that the professor Ana Luisa Muñoz leads to identify, reflect on the sources of inequality and to eliminate them. I also believe this is a key moment we're currently living in Chile. We, at the time, are drafting a new constitution. And at the time, we have a draft for the final constitutional text. And something has happened there in education, which is to include in the purposes of education, in the text, we proposed to include a gender perspective. And that is something unpublished in the history of Chile. It's a unique time, right? That's challenging for everyone, and we hope that this seminar contributes to that conversation. I'd like to thank all the professors that will accompany us today for donating their time, their knowledge, their wisdom. Rosario, Gabriela, Nancy, thank you very much for being here and accompanying us. And Erica did this already, but I'd like to congratulate again Ana Luisa again for her acknowledgement, the award she received last week, actually, as a distinguished former alumni on the PhD of Culture and Society at State University, New York, and Buffalo. So it is we're quite proud of you, Maria Luisa, and on behalf of the School of Education, we'd like to congratulate you. So let's have a great conversation today, and I'd like to greet everyone that is connected today, all the attendees, not only from Chile, Santiago, different regions of Chile, but from other places in Latin America. Thank you very much. We'd like to thank Dean Alejandro Carrasco for his words. We shall continue with our activity, and I'd like to invite the coordinator of human capital of AXI, of Sur scholarships, Mrs. Maria Pastroncoso. Welcome, the floor is yours. Thank you very much, Erika. Good morning. It is a pleasure to greet you from our Chilean executive of the Chilean Agency for International Cooperation for Development, Enrique Fari, authorities present here today. I'd like to greet everyone, Dean, Vice Dean, the panel members, and all the participants, attendees of this second webinar on gender dialogues in education within the cycle, the framework on educational challenges in times of post-pandemic. I'd like to greet the organization and the excellent work conducted by the School of Education UC, and the different international and national experts that are accompanying us this morning. For our institution, we're proud to collaborate on this type of initiative, extending through the policy of international cooperation, Chile's national policy for cooperation, different discussions that are relevant regarding the current challenges in Latin America and the Caribbean in terms of the implementation of inclusive and gender-based education. A few days ago, our Minister of Foreign Affairs, Mrs. Antonia Urrejola, has been sharing in her public account the current challenges of our Chilean chancellery in terms of prioritizing the drive or the fostering of a new foreign policy that is feminist, understanding this as a public policy with a transforming vision that seeks to install the human rights focus or approach and gender approach as elements that are important in the ministry in all its fields of action, to which our ACSID, our agency, has adhered to. The incorporation of this gender approach in public policies and also on educational policies are a collective effort, and it is necessarily participatory. And within its task, it needs to revise actions in terms of gender equality in schools to incorporate concepts such as gender perspective, intersectionality, and inclusion in the different training and workspaces. we need to identify gaps for representation and other deficits for non-sex education. And the approach is fundamental for the different stories, to align the stories we're having today and to advance to concrete practices in current education. Our Agency of International Cooperation for Development has distinguished the importance of this for Chile and the region of Latin America and the Caribbean, how inclusive and fair education and quality education, how important this is and how this contributes to sustainable development goals, the known as SDGs and the 2030 Agenda. This initiative is part of the commitments that our country has assumed in achieving the goals established for the purpose. In this regard, it is our pleasure and we're quite happy as an agency for this seminar to happen, which is a great opportunity to go deep into relevant discussions and to exchange different ideas and experiences. And we have the professional and technical missions that seek to comply with the objectives of this activity. Finally, I'd like to wish you a great day today. And hopefully we can target all of our objectives. Thank you very much, and let's have a great day. Thank you very much, Maria Paz, for your words. Before continuing with our webinar, I would like to thank you for all your greetings from Honduras, Costa Rica, Venezuela, Argentina, Ecuador, Guatemala, El Salvador, and also from other parts of Chile, other regions, Arica, Iquique, Melipilla, and Pirque. Thank you very much for accompanying us today in this seminar. We'd also like to remind you that your questions can be formulated to the chat box of the YouTube channel of Universidad Católica, and they'll be responded or answered by our guest when they finish their respective presentations. Now, and just to provide a brief introduction to the seminar, and to introduce our panel members, I'd like to leave you with the scholar of the School of Education at Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile, PhD in Educational Policy and Society Culture from the State University of New York, Buffalo. I'd like to leave you with Professor Ana Luisa Muñoz. Welcome, Ana Luisa. Thank you very much, Erica. And I'd like to begin by thanking AXI for building this joint platform with the School of Education. I'd also like to thank the Dean of the School of Education, Alejandro Carrasco, our Vice Dean, Pilar Cox, the entire communications team that is behind all this, both Paulina, Victor, Patricio, Mara, everyone that's dedicated time and energy to each detail we have behind all this entire effort for just to open conversations today. I'd also like to thank not only the participation of our guests today, Gabriela, Nancy, Rosario, but also the intellectual complicity and the political commitment that has us conversing in these spaces on gender and education. Without the commitments and feminist partnerships, as Maria Paz mentioned, to install gender issues in institutional spaces, none of this would be possible. We wouldn't have gender education dialogues. We wouldn't have languages to articulate the situations of violence in all of our spaces in daily living, and possibly the intellectual projects of gender themes or issues in universities would continue being marginal or would be outside of the academy. What many authors have called the systemic ignorance on these topics. And it is precisely in this point where I'd like to stop a couple of minutes, briefly, just to open the seminar. As you very well know, I work on gender policies and gender policies in knowledge. It's two areas that are quite intertwined, which have invited me to think about the urgency and how necessary it is not only to open educational debates on gender, but also in opening debates on gender in the institutional spaces. What I'm proposing is not just wordplay, it's two focuses, two approaches that are related, but they're different. They've been developed for decades from the feminist epistemology. And something that I've developed from the Fondesit project, along with Mara Silva, also Andrea Lira, Hirar Hiner, who are colleagues with whom we've talked. And we have different legitimate and legitimized topics. We have an open question that I'd like to install, which shapes this seminar, is what's the knowledge on gender and education that are being recognized in institutional spaces and those that have been left for the space of ignorance? How are we able also to install an epistemic dialogue that lets us open conversations, not only of that knowledge on gender, on education that is legitimate and agreed, but those that remove epistemological, cosmological positions on the world that we build and who we want to be in that world. As our dean mentioned, our countries intensely conversing on the foundations that sustain us constitutionally. And this panel opens themes on gender and education and challenges of educational policies in a specific context of crisis, but also of a pandemic. The invitation that I'm extending now is to our panel members is to hear and to discuss beyond the seminar on these topics that are gathering us today. They're quite relevant. They're very relevant for Chile. So I'd like to introduce our guest. I'd like to introduce Rosario Olivares Saavedra. She's feminist, professor of philosophy, PhD in IDEA in USACH, scholar academic of Universidad Alberto Hurtado. She's currently a gender subject under Directory of Sexual Matters in the Ilustre Municipality of Santiago. Gabriela Badwinder is a PhD in Gender Studies, National University of Córdoba, Argentina, and adjunct researcher that for Chile is currently associated on the Center of Culture and Society of Cognizant. And finally, I'd like to introduce Nancy Lesko, Masculine Green Professor in Contributions to Education and President of the Curriculum and Teaching Teachers College of University of Columbia in the US. I'd like to remind you, as Erika said, that when we finish the presentations, our panel members can respond questions that were asked through the chat box of the YouTube channel of Universidad Católica. Now, to begin with these lectures, I'd like to leave you with Rosario Olivares Saavedra, who will present gender approaches for education in the new constitution. Thank you very much, Rosario, for your time and for your work and for everything you've been contributing in the municipality. Thank you. Thank you, Ana Luisa, for the invitation. Welcome to everyone. It is a pleasure for me to be sharing with you different themes that are related with fundamental matters now for education in Chile before 2018. In different moments, I've been in the School of Education of Universidad Católica, and I believe it's very important for us to be today always updating these ideas, which I believe are critical. Briefly, when I sent the summary of my presentation, I thought, since we're here with our peers and people from other countries are hearing, it's worth noting what the story has been, our story has been, and what's the epistemological, pedagogical base to think about an education with gender focus in this process that we're living in Chile. I'd like to share some images with you, and I'd like to tell you a bit about my presentation. I'd like to mention that it is thrilling to be going through a moment like the one we're going through in 2022, where we have a historical moment where what we've been working on for many times, the feminist professor, seems like it's starting to shape. It's much more tangible. We're becoming material, and this initiates a movement that for a long time we tried to focus it on the conflicts of education. These are images of 2006. This is contemporary history of the 21st century in education, of the student movement. This is going for market education, which is something that is quite rooted in Chilean education that we didn't think about with gender perspective, but it's quite adjunct to certain pillars of education, which are hampering the right of the semi-education to be obtained in a concrete and specific manner. This occurred from 2006 to 2011. Now we have a president of the Republic that belongs to this social movement that went from 2011, moments that are very important and key, particularly in 2016, 2017, 18, when we're organizing in Chile through the CONFECH, the first Congress on non-sexist education prior to 2018, where we started to reflect already regarding the fundamental elements that we would have to think on to combat sexism in education, based on education and violence that sexual dissidences and females were suffering, that we're working on at the time. We got through secondary and university ways paths in 2018, and the students started incorporating all these concepts from feminism, thinking about education, how they were excluded from education, not only how they were excluded, for example, this is from Liceo Uno, which is a school of girls, just for girls in Chile. Not only do we have the segregation of sex and gender in education, but also the epistemological segregation, as Analisa mentioned, the generation of knowledge that was absolutely patriarchal if you review the curriculum, but it's a patriarchal um, system on the creation of communities, on how you thought about the purposes of education, the aims of education, and the students start taking this debate after this Congress, and this transforms into a large riot on 2018, which is called May 2018. We call it different titles of our milestones in history, but it wasn't only May, right? It's a process in 2018 which is critical. 2018 is a critical year, but also from the feminist perspective, this will be a milestone for what we're drafting in the Constitution now. The feminist movement has many decades in Chile, but it has a protagonist role now, and it's focused again in the political and educational debate, and this is done through education. I believe it's very relevant to focus on this because this will be done in education, but in addition, many things will be happening in the world, right? We have someone peer from Argentina here. We have the international feminist movement, and that is critical for the present. In Chile, the same happens, the movement of Me Too, right? Ni una menos in Spanish, the legal pass of femicide with a connotation it didn't have before. Well, you discuss an abortion. We win abortion in 3 cases. We start to have the largest marches and riots in the history of Chile, which is not only from the riot, but the first one was on May 8th, 2018 was the largest one in Chile. It was very important because when the feminist strike started, which is also an international movement that in Chile was taking a lot of space, which lets us set the grounds of what the feminism will start growing in education. In 2019, I was a spokesperson for the 8th of March coordinator. This is very important because it was the first time we had a spokesperson in education, and it was in 2018. This came from different university students and teachers for us to teachers for the first time to be able to have a voice within the feminist movement in education, because in general, those that were leaders were the students before. So that's how we start epistemologically building what we will understand by non-sexist education. Hopefully, those that hear us in general, we talk about feminist education, gender-based education, co-education, but in Chile, we spoke about non-sexist education. This emerges precisely because it is a concept need. For example, how do we oppose to the concept to sexist education? By saying that we want a non-sexist education, but this wasn't a pedagogical or educational category. How do we oppose to this consignment? So is self-management of scholars, academics, and university, of teachers in schools that was providing this conceptual construction. I believe that that is critical. How, based from the social movement, can we have the different concepts that after education, later education will take to work on structural reforms, such as the ones that we will hear if the Constitution, the draft of the Constitution is approved in September. there's a very relevant historical process that our students have opened, and it starts on the 18th of October again, right? When students themselves start to have strikes rights because of the subway price increase. And then we start with this new breather for this new political cycle, which made us understand that we had an intergenerational feminist movement, that we're here because many other women fought for us to be able to do so. And each of our topics or disciplines, I'm also plan of the network of feminist philosophers, where we're working on acknowledging all the philosophers that opened the path to those of us that are here in the School of Philosophy and Humanities of most universities in Chile, because we do believe that undoubtedly that struggle that they saw that lets us have feminist seminars now and bachelors in philosophy for us to speak about gender-based didactical manners in pedagogy is because there's a historical labor and task that has built gender-based and feminist knowledge, which is critical and theoretical. Many feminist thinkers have conceived. We needed to make our work visible, to build a feminist way of thinking that let us think about education and about feminism. As Bell Cook says, it's for everyone, because education is for everyone and it is a universal right. Therefore, when we change the grounds of education, we're thinking about how that education will make much more sense for everyone. We're currently going through a moment that is very important. How, based on how the feminist movement mobilized to be able to approve the referendum of entry, right? The entry referendum for us to conduct the constituent process. And it has to do with how we started building initiatives that allow to think about non-sexist education in the Constitution. This is a picture, the presentation of the proposal of feminist education for Chile, which was the only feminist proposal that was conducted in the constituent process through a popular initiative. I don't know if everyone knew this. We gathered 15,000 signatures. We took this to discussion. This initiative, we have it in the network, feminist network. Red Docente Feminista is the other organization that emerges in 2018. We're with Elisa Loncon when we gave her the proposal, because in addition, I think that fundamental matters are also important here. I'm just going to leave you with that. I thought I put my time here and I didn't, but please let me know if I exceeded my time. I just want to stop and tell you some elements I think are critical. We are currently going through a reality in Chile that has changed much if you compare with the last years. That's why it's important to me to show the symbolic delivery of the proposal draft law for Chile, a bill that we gave to Elisa Loncon, that representative, because we're talking about political positioning regarding education, that most feminist organizations that we've led and we academic scholars, we work on this purpose on our sections. We work on an intersectional perspective or approach to think about an education where centrality is not, or not only focused on females or women. In fact, the sexual dissidences movement in Chile has been critical to be able to have and debate the law or the act on integral sexual education, which unfortunately we lost in Congress in the last 3 years, but which currently emerges in the draft of the new constitution as a right that is ensured. That advancement could have been possible without the sexual dissidence movement and the female movement if they didn't work together. And I believe it's relevant to think about the role I currently have in Santiago, which is a district that has more than 50% of its inhabitants that are migrants. We have schools where total students are migrants, and in the midst of a crude migratory crisis, intersectionality of educational thought is critical. We also need to acknowledge, and that's also in the new constitution, that we're a plurinational state. Therefore, that debate that is now coming of the lowering of those articles to the educational reality, I believe it's critical. We had a conversation not so long ago in the constituent process. I had to present and advocate for the gender approach of feminism within the article of education with the vice president of the convention, who asked us if it was necessary in the article of education for us to say that education must be anti-racism with gender approach, because the state was already acknowledging that characteristic. So I believe there's many dialogues that are quite profound that are still missing on how we read this document, like the Constitution, how what we discuss there will be specifically lowered, concretely lowered into what our students are currently going through, because we're currently in a moment where the violence that we live in the classroom has reemerged. We'll be able to share this with our peers from the US and Argentina, because post-pandemic has been a milestone that we didn't speak about that much, the return we had to that we had to class in person. And this had to do with it rendered much violence, not only in the classroom, but outside of the classroom, not only through harassment and sexual abuse, but the persecution, violence we lived through in the streets. We're living a civil crisis, right? Civilization crisis post-pandemic through the process that the feminist movement has conducted, which leads us to think about the alternatives for change, what the critical measures should be for education to be able to be enshrined as a universal right with a gender approach, and for not only to be a list of supermarkets of the characteristics that education, gender-based education should have, but to transform education. And in that structural transformation, I think that there's a feminist reading that is absolutely cross-cutting for those of us that work in the from the epistemological point of view, that we females, we didn't come and get a drawer and a sector within the education of health, but we're looking for entire education and health to be able to be thought of from this perspective, gender perspective, and for us to integrate it to our cultural and educational practices, social practices, and not to always come back to give that workshop, gender workshop, since like it happens to us, for professors, and then 5 years later we have to do these workshops again because things haven't changed. We're going through a critical moment now, historical moment for the profound changes we need, and I'm quite happy that Chile is going through many milestones now, which had not happened in other parts of the world. It's hard to find a constitution that enshrines integral sexual education and non-sexist education in its fundamental text of rights. And I believe that all this is thanks to the work of millions of people that led us to think about an epistemological topic based on the bodies that inhabit our school. And we can't find that in any other educational theory, really. Thank you very much. Thank you, Rosario. I admire you profoundly, not only your work, but your work on the convention and the intense and complex work from an intersectional perspective that you develop in the municipality of Santiago. So thank you very much for your willingness and participating in different instances. Thank you very much for the solidarity with the work of our colleagues. I'd now like to invite Gabriela Bar, PhD in Gender Studies in the National University of Córdoba, Argentina, who will talk about feminist bids for decolonizing, decapitalizing, and to depatriarchalize higher education. Thank you, Gabriela Bard. Welcome. Hello, Luisa. Thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you, everyone, for inviting me. I have a small presentation, and I'll share it. It's hard for me not to exceed time, but anyway, in a complex topics such as this one, I'd like to comment that what I'm presenting today is not closed topics or topics that are being debated all the time in the spaces that I participate, both academically and politically. And my presentation, the purpose is to provoke, to go beyond what we usually discuss when we think about the gender agendas within universities. I'd like to start this conversation by pointing out something that's very important from an American intellect that is specialized in African philosophy, and his name is Gordon Lewis, and he reflects on the neoliberal obsession of academics and scholars for just appearing as intelligent, formal, trying to effectively intervene in society and turn the thinking and the critical doing, political doing to politicize our interventions and theory and our interventions and theory that is currently weakened in a weak moment where we don't have that much prestige. And that has turned into an activity that's sometimes indecent and is punishable in our universities. I believe this is a neoliberal masculinization of the world, right? That we're looking at in different contexts. And regarding the academic thinking, because it's in more research that we've done with males, it's a typical hegemonical masculinity trait of the academy of trying to control and dominate and simulate at the same time, or never seem like they're ignoring or that they're wrong or they have any questions in any field that we're debating. Hegemonical masculinity is then a mandate of power. As Rita Segato says, it is a mandate of economic power, political and intellectual power. That is a paradox in the case of education, because the work of all researchers, intellectuals, or research is to think about an activity, a movement process. Different debate is a series of disruptive and constant acts and curiosity for the things that we seek to understand and not control or dominate, as is proper of the Western masculine subjectivity. So I gathered this invitation to think critically on the part of Lewis, and I brought as a consideration for everyone here some elements to debate on regarding a diagnosis on the coloniality of our universities, and to reflect on if it's possible to depatriarchalize, decolonize, and decapitalize the production of academic knowledge with some horizons or clues for this purpose. In that regard, I'd like to mention that I'm going to show some plural inputs built from feminist associations that I participate in. We have different dialogues, participations, readings from years of research, studies, different experiences, feminist experiences with others, and academic works as a researcher and as a teacher. No gender teacher marked as white and from the working sector. In that regard, I'm sorry for the noise. I'm here at my household. But anyway, in that regard, I'm not the subject that historically is expected, right, from university in terms of class trajectory, gender trajectory, and political position, where I see an important aspect, the resistance to racism of power, of knowledge, and of gender. So what I'm proposing is a partial synthesis of reflection from a geocorpus located place, which is in the province of Córdoba in Argentina, from a feminized position where I resist to being whited, and from a theoretical approach, which is within a decolonial and feminist approach. This is part of a decolonizing exercise to put our own bodies as body territory, land. When we talk about the Guatemala and Bolivian females, community females, because that's how we can give to our own experience and to make visible. And no one's talking about a non-place as androcentrism, positivist androcentrism of the dominant sciences mentioned. This is all built in a place of class, of gender, and racial. It is a temporary accumulation of knowledge subject to transformation and epistemic revisions. Could you put this in presentation mode, Gavi, because we can't really see it? Sorry for the interruption. Thank you. You see better now? Yes. Anyway, I was saying that regarding patriarchy and institutions, thinking about universities as institutions that have been devices for colonization and subsequently of coloniality of power and knowledge of gender, we need to mention that, as stated by the feminist movements of the Americas and our Bolivian peers, female peers, in the voice of activists such as Maria Galindo, that we cannot decolonize without depatriarchalizing. We can't depatriarchalize without, if we do not address, in addition, the mercantilization of scientific knowledge and the epistemic racism that is characterizing it, and which impacts in turn different multiple dimensions of university configuration. And at this point, racism is critical to analyze the class, gender, and knowledge production intersections. Now, what I mentioned in the beginning of situating the body in the globalization, neoliberal globalization processes of higher education, etc., that provide as an effect or turn into neocolonialism, what we call neocolonialism. And we need to mention that universities are still framed within the gender without knowing and the origins, and up to now aspects that are expressed in multiple dimensions that go from hegemonical epistemologies that we teach in university, the theories and authors that are shared in the different lectures or educational spaces, and the architecture organized in the space of universities. Therefore, I believe that the challenge that we have to think about the situation is to be able to exit this logic, which trends to be a technocracy agenda, right? A technocracy of appropriation of concepts that we built in social movements, which has to do with this idea of equality, inclusion, or diversity, but transited from the capitalist logic, sweetened from the capitalist logics and from humanism of university. On the contrary, in feminisms, we're speaking about bets to transform the roots of institutions that are devices of the central power of capitalism, right? But as a question then I will pose, can schools be a space that we can decolonize? To respond to this, let's analyze the statement that we won't be able to democratize university without addressing epistemic racism that dominates our universities. Universities, in effect, are spaces of social whitening, a concept that Mara Viveros is offering. Mara Viveros is a female intellectual from Colombia, to capture how people nowadays, when they enter university, how they see that those spaces and the access to degrees can be ways or processes that allow to escape what is Black as an association of class and as an association of gender, right? Because for decolonized feminisms, we can't differentiate gender, class, and race. That is intertwined, that is joined in the same operation of decoloniality. So race, as Quijano explained, these are the joint manners that we class. They make us unequal, and they're installed in our America from the conquer, and that had not been able to revert in our universities. So universities, and there's some place in Argentina for popular classes, they've lost that place for interpreting these social increase promotion spaces, and they saw that we haven't ensured that, because we have this is like a mirage, right? It doesn't mean that these degrees lets us have better life conditions, right? But this is still a model in which we make sure we can ensure a better way of social existence for those with their marked bodies, such as indigenous, Black, farmers. When they go through these institutions, this enables this whitening process. Whitening as a synonym of progress, civilization, from the capitalist-centric approaches. Therefore, university, people assume a process that Marguerite calls this social whitening, right? Where they interact with ideological knowledge, social and personal knowledge. And the whitening in university, that dimension is adverted and is noticed in the daily practices that groups conduct and social individuals. They identified as non-white and from popular sectors that constantly try to adjust to the social and cultural and moral events imposed by the elite or what the white class. But from a historical perspective, university is a political space that is important to reproduce the device of race, a category that had a relevant place for Western scientific thinking, which allowed to articulate modernity in terms of whiteness. In case of America, and as explained, the non-scholars, the movements, feminist movement, decolonized indigenous feminists explained, mestiçage was a process, compulsory process of the integration of these groups that have been marginalized from universities through these contamination processes and the invisibilization of our indigenous origins or First Nations origins. I see I have 4 minutes, therefore I will try to go directly into deep patriarchalization because I don't have more time. If we understand that within universities, the distribution of respect, which is usually one of the main aspects that concern the sectors that we normally do not consider, are not normally considered respectable, those racially marked, gender marked, and class marked bodies. Respect is normally accessible through policies that universities implement through multicultural policies and the policies of gender technocracy. These processes of gender inequalities are usually where the gender issues start to be, they start incorporating females in quantitative terms. That's how they breach this. Okay, I'll add women in terms of corporality, but not in terms of impact and the epistemologies and the approaches and relationships that happen in universities, producing technocracies of gender technocracies, where feminisms that were historically incorporated to universities in terms of fights and the advancement of rights and struggle, they end up being absorbed by these institutions in gender technocracy with inclusion policies that are really just non-acknowledging other ways of knowledge and experiences of women that are not the women that are using spaces progressively in the university. So I don't have that much time but I wanted to mention we have to think about how we can face racism in universities to face the marketization and re-patriarchalization of university processes, because that is something that we're seeing in different research papers. Despite we've advanced in terms of gender, there's many institutions that are going through a neo masculinization process with ways of sophistication of those processes where they're not that evident anymore. They're micro policies. They have to do with exclusions that are not that approachable because they're not that clear in the eyes of feminisms that have hegemonized the field. So decolonizing this, demercantilizing and depatriarchalizing the university means we should address race, class, and social orientation, right? Because we cannot stop mentioning the university are still heteronormative institutions when any expression that's outside of the heterosexual matrix is criminalized, is invisibilized, and is excluded. Therefore, these processes of resisting to the westernization, androgenization, and the whitening of knowledge cannot just merely be reduced to an instauration of gender quota policies, to gender living devices, protocols, and all these initiatives that are celebrated. They're welcome, but they are not enough, because what we're needing, what we want to do now, we need to change the paradigm of how universities are understanding this, and the inclusion different sectors that are not only academic sectors or illustrated sectors, and these how we include all this in this debate, spaces for debates. We need to include others, and we need to revisit and think about these proposals that I brought from the epistemologies, South global ones, that decolonize the indigenous farmers. What we need is to converse with other social stakeholders to validate their knowledge and to product intersectional knowledge with an utopical sense, heterotopic as to recover those concepts as a horizon that guides more than a concrete method of how to do this. It's something that has to accompany us in a permanent manner to see how we decolonize bodies, how we decolonize practices and relationships. Epistemic disobedience, it is disobedience of the position of bodies and disobedience of social relationships. Thank you very much. I still have a lot to work to provide information. A pleasure to hear you, Gabi. Yes. Thank you for all these ideas and for this conversation. As you very well said in the beginning, this is a live activity, right? It is an activity that not only those of us that build are going through this, but it has a direct impact on how we imagine both our daily life and the institutional spaces. So I'd like to thank you very much for your provoking presentation, and thank you very much. Now, I'd like to leave you to conclude with the presentations. I'd like to invite Nancy Lesko with her topic, and I'd like to leave Nancy Lesko with you. She's an academic from the University of Columbia, the US, teaching college, and her topic is called Thinking with Trans. Thank you very much, Nancy, for your generosity and taking the time to talk with us. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation, Ana Luisa, and thank you for the previous speakers. And I think I hope there'll be some connections, or people will see some connections. So I will share my screen. Here we go. And I just want to say as a kind of beginning that my work at Teachers College, from its name, is with teachers, with people who are becoming teachers, people who have already been teachers in early childhood, elementary, secondary schools. And so this presentation, I think, is infused with those perspectives, although I think many of the things that I'm talking about are absolutely crucial for universities and for teacher education as well. So just really, what I'm going to briefly try to do is kind of explain what I mean about thinking with trans and gender and sexuality as being kind of in process. I'm going to talk a little bit about bodies and how we think about bodies, and then strategies to kind of loosen our attachments. And here again, in schools, both elementary schools, secondary schools, as well as universities, to expectations around cisgender. All right, that's not right. All right, so I'm using a project done by a Korean artist called the Pink and Blue Project to think about our orientations towards sexuality and gender. And I think in general, we think about sex and sexuality and gender as fixed. They're determined, they pre-exist. Here, Lauren and Carolyn's entree into the world of gendered toys, of clothing, of particular conversations with adults, but we're also with peers. So we think of them as fixed and kind of inevitable. And in thinking about the series of photographs that this artist has done in the Pink and Blue Project, we could think a little bit about the kinds of relationships and aspirations and conversations, vocabulary that might occur with Lauren and Carolyn and their pink things. Whether we're thinking of adults or children, there's particular kinds of play that would happen with their belongings that we see arrayed around them. There are particular conversations about their interests, what books they gravitate towards of the ones here, the softness and the roundedness of the materials that they have in their toys. There might be conversations that adults ask, well, what do you want to be when you grow up? Do you want to have children? There might be play that involves nurturing or caring for others. They might play house. They might play a teacher, and we might have different kinds of relationships going on. So again, part of the same artist project, we have Ethan and his blue things. And here again, we might think about how the Ethan's belongings, which we imagine, at least I imagine, are always gifts from people, right? From parents, from families, from friends, etc. What kinds of play Ethan might engage in, what kinds of questions he might answer about what his interests are, what his aspirations might be, how the kind of play that occurs with the objects arrayed around Ethan, as opposed to which are kind of, we might say, more angular, harder, of different kinds of materials than Carolyn and Lauren. And so again, we can kind of build out from these photographs some kind of thoughts about how people are interacting with Ethan and what they're thinking of him, what they're thinking of his future in gifting him or buying him particular kinds of things. And in general, I think I'm going to just talk here a little about these expectations about sex, gender, and sexuality and what I have talked about initially as kind of assumptions about that they're already determined, that they're accomplished, that young people come into the world already with things fixed. And I just want to, just for kind of definitional sake, the way that I'm talking, when I'm talking about this lining up, this idea, this assumption of the lining up of sex, gender, and sexuality, that sex refers to characteristics of the physical body, what are often now talked about, the sex that's assigned at birth. Gender refers to psychological attributes and social behaviors that are associated with being a boy, being a girl, being masculine, being feminine, and sexuality refers to the realm of erotic desires and practices. So I think that we often assume that that sex, gender, and sexuality will line up. And what I mean by that is, if going back to Carolyn and Lauren and their pink things, we assume that because Lauren and Carolyn have been assigned female at birth, that they will want to dress in particular ways with particular colors, soft fabrics. They'll talk in particular ways. They'll develop particular kinds of relationships with people, aspire to have particular perhaps kinds of intimate relationships with other people, aspire to particular careers, and that they'll be erotically attracted to the opposite sex. Similarly for Ethan, was assigned male at birth, that the expectation from the toys and belongings arrayed in the photograph are that he'll play in certain ways, he'll be interested in particular kinds of trucks and hammers, harder toys, that he will want to do things that involve sports and trucks and aspire to perhaps particular kinds of engineering careers, for example, and that he'll be erotically attracted to the opposite sex. So those are some of this idea of this kind of lining up. We expect that sex, gender, and sexuality are going to line up. So on this idea that I'm trying to develop of thinking with trans, again, just some definitions that according to Susan Stryker, who has written a history of transgender, trans generally refers to people who move away from the gender they were assigned at birth. They cross over the boundaries constructed by their culture to define and sort of define and contain that gender. And they might do that for various reasons. So what I'm trying to get across here is that I think when we think with trans, that there's this emphasis on the movement across a socially imposed boundary, away from what now people think as an unchosen starting place. So what the sex that we're assigned at birth. And so it's this movement that thinking with trans emphasizes, rather than a particular destination or mode of transition. And so this could include, obviously, transgender could include this movement or this being in process that I'm talking about. Could involve cross-dressing, it could involve hormones, it could involve various surgeries, it could involve living as a member of another gender, etc. And doesn't need to necessarily include any one particular things. So why think with trans? I think what the trans movement does, it shows how the normative categories of girl, boy, male, female, masculine, feminine, and the expectations that we attach to them of how people will act, how they will dress, what their interests will be, what kind of stories they want to read about. All of those connections are arbitrary. There isn't any necessity or deterministic relationship between a particular body and how they enact gender and sexuality. So I think thinking with trans begins to bring these static gender categories and expectations into a different perspective. So I think just some language terms that signal this in-process perspective, and some of these were mentioned in previous presentations. Trans is obviously one. I think other terms that begin to sort of get at the same idea, starting from different places, gender fluid, hybridity can do some of that same work, nomadic subjectivities, multiplicity, context-specific practices, intersectionalities, non-binary. And there are a lot of other terms as well. But I think what each of these terms does is it tries to push back against, to refuse this binary, the two choices. You're either Ethan or you're Lauren or Carolyn, right? You're either a woman or a man. And I think it's just trying to push back against that and to refuse that choice, that those are the only two choices. So in thinking about loosening our attachments to these fixed ideas, to this lining up of sex, gender, and sexuality, I think thinking from the US perspective and thinking from a school, elementary, secondary schooling perspective, I think many people are affected by these rigid ideas and fixed ideas about gender and sexuality. And they're not just trans and LGBTQ people. Monique Morris in her book, Push Out, for example, connects the over-disciplining of Black girls with ideas in schools about what proper femininity is, which is obviously racialized, but as well, it's a particular expectation of how someone who is identified as a girl will dress, how she will speak, at what level her voice will at what level or tone of voice and attitude she'll use in her speaking and so forth. And Ferguson, who has done work on Black boys in public schools, also links the over-disciplining and expulsion of Black boys with the sexualizing of them and adultifying them, that young boys are seen as aggressive and as older and as threats, and that sense of seeing them as already on the way to prison, for example. Also affects Black boys, whether they are trans, LGBTQ, or straight. C.J. Pascoe's work also, I think, shows that the under-disciplining of white boys is linked with this boyifying or what I call are trivializing misbehavior, or the common phrase in the US, boys will be boys. So when we're talking about these fixed ideas or expectations that sex, gender, and sexuality will line up and be intelligible and can be read sort of, at a glance, so to speak. This obviously affects young people and adults who identify as trans or LGBTQ, but I think it also affects a lot of other students as well. Because these expectations of a proper masculinity, a proper femininity are problematic for lots of different kids. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about how we begin to loosen attachment to these fixed ideas of gender and sexuality, and just dwell for a minute or two on bodies, and specifically from the perspective of body modifications. And so here, and I'm going to turn to a number of images really shortly, but just the starting point is that all human bodies are modified bodies. We're all shaping our bodies every day according to particular cultural practices, but some body modifications are met with outrage, hatred, disgust. So I'm going to use images from the US, but I suspect that in the Chilean and Argentinian and other Latin American contexts, you have similar kinds of kind of categories of people. So Laverne Cox and Elliot Page are two actors, trans actors, and often I think when trans actors are presented, their transition, their physical transition, the body modification that they've gone through ends up being quite highlighted, and it's almost it becomes a spectacle often of this trans bodies. And so what I'm trying to do here is kind of sort of try to place it more in the realm of this is what we all do. We all modify our bodies. And so just a few images of other kinds of body modifications that don't seem to receive the same amount of, kind of disgust or resentment, or the sense of it's unnatural that trans bodies do. And of course, this is Barry Bonds, a baseball player, on the left before steroids and after steroids, and Lance Armstrong always on steroids. I think I'm also thinking body modifications, including tattoos and piercings. The red carpet awards are always perfect for thinking about celebrity body modifications, right? These are the most valued or privileged modifications, but they're modifications, right? We know a little bit, right, about what goes into the production of these images. So on loosening our attachment to particular gender and sexuality ideas, and here I'm thinking about schools again, universities, but I'm also thinking about early childhood spaces, as well as elementary and secondary schools, and really some kind of questions and orientations or starting points. Do school practices reinforce gender binaries? This idea that there's a particular lining up of sex, gender, and sexuality. And here I think dress codes, dress uniforms, the expectation of pronouns, the reference, this I think tends to happen more in elementary and secondary school, where teachers will refer to boys and girls. We'll have the young men be in this group, we'll have the young women be in a different group, that kind of separating, assuming that there are, particular identifiable things that are being separated there. And I think traditional practices, whether those are in dress codes, can often reinforce these gender binaries. I think another thing that I think as an educator, sort of how we can be transgressive of cis norms, of this linking, this kind of traditional linking of sex, gender, and sexuality. For example, an article I love to use in class is about a middle school male teacher who just started using a Hello Kitty lunchbox, right? Which is a kind of logo that's much more, that's pink, that's much more likely to be affectionately connected with girls and young women. But just as a way of sort of that transgression then becomes an opportunity for the teacher to sort of talk about why can't I have a Hello Kitty lunchbox? I think self-reflection among teachers on their own gender and sexuality lessons. Examining gender and sexuality in the media is, I think, always an excellent place to start. Conversations about bodies and how bodies are read, and researchers Elizabeth Meyer and Bethy Leonardi talk about kind of trying to develop a culture of conversation in schools. And I think one of the things is about bodies and how bodies are read. And then I think finally to raise questions about how things have always been done. Again, that idea that well, we've always done it this way. We've always had this assembly or this performance. It's always had girls doing some things, boys doing some things. And I think, again, the sort of to begin to kind of ask questions at least about, well, you know, we can think differently than we always have been, and how and who's excluded and who's included as if we continue to follow those traditions. So those just are some of the references, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Thank you, everybody.
Muchas gracias, Nancy.
Thank you very much, Nancy, for your presentation. I believe that thinking about the attachment that we have with the fixed ideas on gender issues, it's a starting point that is key in terms of transformation. When in the beginning, the introduction of this panel, someone mentioned that there was this need of having diversity of perspective, epistemological and ontological perspectives to be able to talk and converse about dialogue. You were actually able to see this on the presentations. There's a diversity in terms of what we are talking about, different topics, but it's quite relevant to acknowledge that when we talk about gender perspective or gender issues, there's not only one way of addressing this feminist perspectives, but also we need to focus on certain themes or topics that are relevant in the field of education. So yet again, I'd like to thank all the panel members for your great presentations. And I'd like to begin with the Q&A panel. I'm going to get those questions from my cell phone. I'd also like to thank everyone that's left comments. Erika Angulo said that the didactic of gender approach is something that is very current, very important. Thank you for this efforts. Thank you for your explanations. I'd like to thank the School of Education from Costa Rica. They're saying neo-patriarchy with sophisticated policies is going towards the path by path or step by step by going through justice. And thank you very much for gathering part of what Gabriela's presentation. Thank you, Gabriela, for her presentation. And I'm going to leave 3 open questions. I'm not going to point on anyone, but I'll be thankful for your comments. How can we install in initial teaching training a didactic and transformative gender approach? Number 2, how can the paradigms on gender issues, how are these paradigms, how could they open to other spaces with a gender approach? And number 3 is, how do we address the work with trans and children and youth in an educational establishment that resists to those people that escape the norms, right? I don't know if these questions were clear or not, but we have the first one. The second one is the paradigms that should be necessary for displacing, for talking about themes that we believed were installed. And number 3 is inclusion of the trans youth and children in an educational system that resist. How do we do this in an educational system that resists to this? So the mic is now open. I don't know if you'd like to start, maybe Rosario, Gabi, and then Nancy, whoever wants to start. Yes, thank you very much. I'd like to comment something. The work with trans individuals regarding what Nancy mentioned, it's very interesting what happens in Chile. My presentation, I didn't say this, but one of the things that I've proposed this last time that helped transform Chilean education was precisely the visibilization of the trans youth. In Chile, trans people, generally adults, trans adults linked to certain types of work. We know that the life expectancy in trans individuals is 35 years of age here in Chile. Therefore, for there to be the trans youth, and for those the youth to arrive to school, that transformed everything. We currently have orientations in the Ministry of Education. We have got an orientation for them, but we haven't had any major changes. And there's going to be a draft bill on the bill. There's the act that's called Jose Matias. There's a trans kid that committed suicide due to the bullying, and the act is named on his behalf. And we could probably have a bill and work on a bill that could make us have a more humane treatment within the educational spaces. And we'd like to highlight that we have the Society of Trans that is called OTD, that is Organizing Trans Diversities. And that's OTD that works on with training, accompaniment for parents, and we work with gender fluids and non-binary individuals in education in Chile. There's much also happening with these topics, and I believe it's worth noting we have the first trans representative deputy here in history of Chile, and that makes the trans youth protect themselves, foresee their future with different life possibilities. So I'm great doing this. I was the head of campaign for election campaign for Emilia Schneider, who was our first trans representative in Chile. So we currently have enough work to have the tools for that purpose in Chile. There's a trans school also in the district of Ñuñoa. We have schools that are not characterized. They're not mixed boys and girls. I don't know how you use it in other countries, but we call it mixed. In Chile, we used to have a lot of monogeneric education that's just for boys and just for girls, different schools just for girls, just for boys. And now we have multi-diverse schools of diversity. They're not even called we don't even call them boys and girls school anymore. In fact, in Santiago, in the district where I work, we're going to invest in infrastructure, which will have genderless bathrooms in all the schools of Santiago, of this district of Santiago. So things are happening, and I believe they're very important to seek that material. The other thing I'd like to mention is that the advances in initial teacher training have been also significant. I've had to work on many FIT programs in different universities across Chile, and it is my pleasure. I think it's great that we're working on this. I teach didactics of philosophy, and I tell my pedagogy students, well, we have gender-focused philosophy unit. I tell them that the opportunities that teachers have nowadays of being able to have initial training or initial teaching or education with all this in their curriculum or syllabus, not only in pedagogy, but in the epistemological dispute in the history of philosophy. They have intersectional feminist philosophy, etc., and also in curriculum in the university, at least where I work. All that is already integrated in their training, initial training. So I think that it's important because feminist thinking is a collective construction. So it's important for us to look at our own experience in the different universities and to be able to collaborate in this collective construction, because we believe it's very important for initial training to have this focus. In fact, in this integral education bill or the project that we presented, one of the conditions that the act or the law put included that the accreditation process of universities to accredit pedagogies. That meant that the syllabus of pedagogies had to have gender focus and integrated sexual education subjects, and that had to be a requirement for us to accredit them. So the possibility of making those transformations is there. Okay, thank you, Rosario, for your intervention. Now, Gabriela, and then Nancy, to see if we can provide some space, because we don't have much time. Could you remind the question to me, please? It's generally, if you could talk a bit more about epistemological displacements about feminism to think about the gender in education linked with, if you'd like to just add something to that. I believe it's very important that we need to situate each other's political and place, and which in my case is in the University of Córdoba in Argentina. Geopolitically, we have much advancement and significant efforts in addressing gender inequality, but the issue is that approach in gender inequality, all that is being done from logics that for feminism, the translation, academic translation is decolonial, but it has to do with dialogues you have with community popular feminisms in North America. The truth is that all of this is located in the access of white women, cisgender heterosexual women that have been through this whitening, and women that are also incorporated in gender management department per se, which I'm telling the university for a long time, which is without leaving aside the fact that, of course, they impact in some aspects, just like we have more incorporation of women and quantitative, more quantitative incorporation of women.
Académicos, que si bien estamos siempre en la base de la pirámide, cuando mira la pirámide en la universidad siempre estamos en los cargos de menor rango y además realizando lo que llamamos las tareas domésticas universitarias, y que terminan construyéndose también protocolos de atención de la violencia o protocolos de atención de situaciones como abuso sexual, discriminación en el aula para los colectivos de mujeres y sexodisidentes, pero realmente no hay una revisión profunda desde dónde se están planteando epistémicamente estas propuestas. ¿Y qué nos parece a nosotras, como colectivos de feministas que venimos viendo esto? Es que las propuestas tienden a organizarse o en lógicas punitivas, ¿no?, donde la respuesta ante la violencia es la patologización del sujeto, que en teoría estaría ejerciendo la violencia en esas relaciones de género, y por lo tanto se le suele derivar el sistema penal, o se le computa algún tipo de pena o sanción para circular por la universidad, o una revictimización de las víctimas, donde todo el tiempo tienen que estar dando cuenta de lo que les sucede en términos meramente individuales, y que terminan muchas veces escapando a través de estrategias que para nosotras no son efectivas, no son cuidadosas, como tiene que ver con los scratches, ¿no?, con los scratches hacia los varones o hacia los docentes que generan violencia, y que después termina produciendo una vuelta de revictimización de esas propias víctimas. Y eso para mí, con esto puedo cerrar, tiene que ver con que se está generando una especie de tecnocracia del género, ¿no?, que no tiene mucho que ver con lo que los movimientos feministas y quienes consideramos feministas estamos pidiendo a la universidad y a la producción de conocimiento, que es justamente despatriarcalizar, ¿no?, las lógicas que gobiernan la producción de conocimiento y los vínculos al interior de la universidad. Y el sumar mujeres, esta lógica de contar mujeres y sumar mujeres en términos cuantitativos, o incorporar un texto de género en las currículas académicas, no va a modificar el patriarcado al interior de la universidad, porque tiene que ver con una génesis que va de la mano de lo que decía en la presentación, de cómo desarmamos las lógicas raciales de clase y las formas en que entendemos quiénes son productores de conocimiento y cuáles son los cuerpos que son importantes que ocupen esos espacios. Entonces ha habido como una especie de desconexión entre los feminismos académicos, tecnócratas, ilustrados, que empiezan a ser hegemónicos dentro de las universidades, y las mujeres de sectores populares, las mujeres trabajadoras, campesinas, las corporalidades sexodisidentes, que no están incluidas en esas situaciones. Terminan siendo como procesos de subalternización, que no vienen solo de los varones blancos, que son quienes gobiernan en verdad las lógicas universitarias, pero que terminan produciendo una asimilación de las mujeres cisgénero en esas lógicas. Entonces me parece que el señalamiento del feminismo descolonial tiene que ver con eso, con cómo vamos a dialogar no solo con el patriarcado que producen y reproducen los varones, sino que están empezando a generarse desde estos feminismos atravesados por neoliberalismo, por agendas globales de los organismos internacionales de crédito, por las discursividades, como les decía recién, de la tolerancia y de la asimilación. ahí es mi preocupación central. Es debatir con la universidad, pero debatir también con los feminismos que han logrado hegemonía al interior de las universidades, ¿no?
Gracias, Gabriela. Nancy, y ya para ir cerrando, te dejo la palabra por temas de tiempo, ya estamos avanzando. Gracias.
Thank you. I think briefly in relation to this idea of kind of installing a feminist epistemological perspective, a political perspective around trans and critical gender equality. I think that one of the things I see in the US is that teachers are often kind of left between places. So they get either through laws, which it sounds like in Chile, or through university training, they become kind of, they become educated around more diverse and equitable practices in schools and processes. And then they get into particular working situations where they have to sort of deal with a lot of pushback from colleagues who haven't had that similar kind of training or don't have the same perspective about a kind of education being a kind of a critical political process, parents often, at school administrators. And I think that then they're kind of left, often teachers are kind of left on their own and to kind of deal with like, well, what's, you know, is this going to, you know, jeopardize my job or my, you know, kind of status or reputation in the school if I continue to work against this. So I think that I think what happened, part of what I think what's necessary is the kind of ongoing conversation support of the, you know, the recognition that education is always political work. We're always pressing towards things that are unpopular, make people uncomfortable, and then that kind of comes back on us as individual educators as well as on our students. So somehow I think the support to keep kind of critical conversations going where people can kind of bring their, like, what do I say to like, you know, parents who say, I don't want my kids to know about trans, right? And so where do you start? And I think sort of like that there's, you know, language, there's perspectives, there's ways to talk with parents, and that I think it needs to be part of this ongoing political work because it's never in place for in a permanent way.
Super, gracias, Nancy.
Thank you very much, Nancy. Thank you again to the School of Education in NACSI for this space, for the construction, for dialogue. We would continue interacting in YouTube, but we don't have enough time, so it will be there in YouTube. There's many questions that are still arriving. Now, I'm going to leave you with Erika Catalan for a couple of closing words. Thank you. Thank you, Ana Luisa. Okay, we are concluding the second and last online seminar called Gender Dialogues in Education and Activity Frame within the second cycle of webinars organized by Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile and the Chilean Agency for International Cooperation for Development, ACCID, Educational Challenges in Times of Post-Pandemic. I'd like to thank everyone accompanying us today and everyone that participated remotely through streaming through the official YouTube channel of Universidad Católica, to our authorities, both from Universidad Católica, AXI, and our different guests and panel members. Have a great afternoon, and thank you very much.